Now on Eye on Politics, Save Women's Sports. Protesters demonstrate locally against Governor Greg Abbott's signing of a new law requiring college athletes to compete on teams that are the same as their sex at birth. Spending fight. Members of Congress from North Texas expressed concern over passing a new budget in time. What they say about a potential federal government shutdown. And one-on-one with North Texas Congressman Roger Williams, the chairman of the Small Business Committee in the U.S. House, about extending tax cuts for small businesses. I'm Jack Fink. Get your fix for Texas politics. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas starts right now. Hello and welcome. We begin with a report out of the Austin American-Statesman newspaper, which reports a federal grand jury in San Antonio has been reviewing ties between impeached Attorney General Ken Paxton and an Austin developer, Nate Paul. The paper quotes two sources with knowledge of the investigation. Paul is mentioned in some of the articles of impeachment against Paxton, who's accused of abusing his power as Attorney General to benefit himself and the developer. Paxton has denied any wrongdoing. The FBI began investigating Paxton in October of 2020 after 7 of his top hand-picked lieutenants in his office contacted authorities and accused Paxton of bribery, among other allegations. Paul was indicted by a federal grand jury in an unrelated case in June. The impeachment trial against Paxton begins September 5th. He's also facing state securities fraud charges and is set to return to a state court October 6th. Paxton has also denied wrongdoing in the cases involving impeachment and securities fraud. Now to the protests that greeted Governor Greg Abbott at the Texas Women's University in Denton. That's where he held a ceremonial bill signing for the new state law on Monday called Save Women's Sports.
The Save Women's Sports Act is now law in the state of Texas.
Members of the LGBTQ community stood outside Texas Women's University with a message for Governor Greg Abbott about the new state law requiring athletes at public colleges and universities to compete on teams the same as their biological sex.
His legislation is supposed to protect Texans, but he's not protecting trans people. He's hurting trans people.
Inside, 2 former college swimmers, Paula Scanlon and Riley Gaines, joined lawmakers and athletes as Governor Abbott signed the Save Women's Sports Act. Gaines, an NCAA All-American, said when she competed against Leah Thomas, a transgender woman, last year, they tied, but only Thomas received a trophy. Gaines said it was unfair to her and other women.
When Governor Abbott signed the Save Women's Sports Act this summer, he sent a message to approximately 15 million Texan women that they will be treated fairly.
Protesters here say it's not just one bill. Members of the LGBTQ community tell me they believe Republicans in Austin have been targeting their community.
We're here standing against just the flood of legislation that has been attacking trans people.
Go away, Greg!
The governor had a message for protesters and others opposed to the Save Women's Sports Act.
How will they explain to Riley and Paula and to other women how they have been marginalized? They're the ones who went through the training, not the protesters out there.
Any discussion of maintaining the sanctity of women's spaces is labeled transphobic, bigoted, and hateful. What's bigoted and hateful is a discrimination against women and girls happening across the country.
The law takes effect September 1st, and Governor Abbott vowed to defend it vigorously if it's challenged in court. Private universities have the option of complying with the law. And there was another bill signing to tell you about that took longer to achieve than most people thought. We're talking about the $18 billion property tax relief law, which provides homeowners and businesses with relief on their school property taxes. Governor Greg Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and Speaker Dade Phelan attended the ceremony, marking the first time in a long time that the 3 of them have made a joint public appearance. It took 2 special sessions to pass the package of bills because the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker were not on the same page about how to provide property tax relief. The money comes from the state's record surplus of nearly $33 billion.
We know whose money that is. That money belongs to the taxpayers, and we are giving it back to the taxpayers of Texas.
The bill signing took place in New Caney, which is in Montgomery County, north of Houston. Voters are going to have to approve this in November. In other headlines this past week, 15,000 people attended a job fair at the Irving Convention Center. About 375 employers offered a total of 15,000 jobs, most of them here in North Texas. The event was organized by Congresswoman Beth Van Dyne and co-sponsored by a bipartisan group of members of Congress from North Texas and state lawmakers from around North Texas as well. In the past week, a state judge ruled there can be temporary exceptions to the abortion ban in Texas. The ruling came as part of a lawsuit filed by women who suffered from complicated pregnancies and whose doctors wouldn't perform abortions because of the state's ban. The judge in Austin, Jessica Mangrum, said the state couldn't prosecute doctors who terminated pregnancies after making a good faith judgment, and she gave very specific examples of conditions that would keep the state from prosecuting doctors. In response, the Texas Attorney General's office filed an appeal with the Texas Supreme Court, and that blocked the judge's order. Some members of Congress from North Texas are sounding the alarm this week that a spending fight in the U.S. House may delay the approval of a new budget or even lead to a government shutdown. The comments came during a congressional forum presented by the Dallas Regional Chamber Tuesday. I had the privilege of serving as moderator. We interviewed two Democrats, Congressman Mark Vesey and Colin Allred, and two Republicans, Congresswoman Beth Van Dyne and Congressman Keith Self. The members of Congress have been back in their districts this month and returned to Washington September 12th. The new budget year begins October 1st, and there is not a lot of optimism that a spending plan will be passed in time to avoid a government shutdown.
Folks, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are not going to pass 11 bills, Senate pass their 12 bills, get a conference done, get it back to the two houses to pass the final bill by September the 30th.
So hopefully we can avoid it, but I'll agree with my colleague, Congressman Self, that I'm worried about where we're going. I'll certainly do what I can to avoid it, but we're not on a good path.
When we come back, do we want to have a government shutdown? Absolutely not. Are we going to have appropriations bills that are more reflective of pre-pandemic levels as opposed to normalizing the additional money that we spent in an emergency situation? If that is the case, you've already seen that Republicans are willing to vote for that bill, and I think you'll see the appropriations reflective of those numbers will pass.
Yeah, I don't know how really from this point on until January the 3rd, 2025, how we're not going to be able to avoid these sort of showdowns that you watch on cable news.
Nearly 300 business and elected leaders from around the Dallas area attended this week's event in downtown Dallas. Coming up a little later, we'll hear more on what these lawmakers had to say about the government spending and inflation. But up next, we go one-on-one with North Texas Congressman Roger Williams, chair of the Small Business Committee, to talk about extending tax cuts for small businesses. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas returns in a moment. Welcome back. Small businesses here in North Texas and across the country are hoping Congress extends tax cuts for them that will expire at the end of 2025. This week, we spoke with Republican North Texas Congressman Roger Williams, who chairs the Small Business Committee and is a small business owner in Parker County.
Well, our committee, needless to say, is focused on small business, Main Street America. And Main Street America is hurting right now. I mean, we can't get supply chain, we can't get product, we can't get workforce. Taxes are too high. Regulations are choking small businesses. And those are the kind of things we're fighting on our committee to give the economy back to small business where we can compete. You know, small business can compete because the customer will tell us if we're doing a good job or not. We don't need the federal government to tell us we're doing a good job or not. And also, we don't need to compete against the federal government. And you compete against the federal government when they squeeze regulations on you and raise your taxes. That's a problem. We're focused on that in the Small Business Committee, and we're actually getting some things done. Well, the bills we're focused on right now is the fact we need to make tax cuts permanent. That's very important, okay? But we're focused on cutting regulations. Let me give you some numbers. Regulations, when the Biden administration came in, they raised regulations on small business, Main Street America, by $375 billion. Now, for small businesses like mine and those listening to you today, they've got to come up with 220 million man-hours to take care of the $375 billion worth of regulations. Biden's put on them. So we're focused on reducing regulations because if you're a bank and you have to hire a compliance officer rather than a loan officer, that's not a good deal. Or when you're in the car business, you have to hire a compliance officer rather than a salesman, that's not a good deal. So it's costing Main Street America just a ton of money and potential sales by these government regulations that this big burden government is putting on Main Street. We just want to compete.
What kinds of regulations are you talking about?
Well,
you talked a little bit about the compliance officer.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I mean complying to government. For example, I'm also on the Financial Services Committee, okay? You know, the government wants to force banks and lenders to fill out excess paperwork that's just beyond belief. And that creates a big problem. Well, I just got a bill passed called We Did Away with Regulation 1071 that the bankers and consumers are going to love because it's just less involvement in what you're all about as a person that goes to the federal government. So when you talk about regulations, you're talking about burdensome paperwork. You're also talking about a delay in a supply chain. Maybe you have to fill this piece of paperwork out before you get this particular product. And it goes on and on and on. It's hard to name, but we see them every single day.
Well, you mentioned the tax cuts.
Yeah.
Are you talking about the small business tax deduction? Was it 20% that
well,
after 2025 it ends?
It ends, and it's the Trump tax cuts we had in 2016 that opened this economy up because it created lowered taxes. When you lower taxes, you create more taxpayers because businesses make more money. One of the biggest things we did was the expensing, the 100% expensing of fixed assets. So if you went and bought a lift for your business or a piece of equipment for your business, you could choose to deduct it 100%, which is unbelievably positive for a small business, and it makes them want to buy more. And so that's something right there that is huge. 100% expensing is a big deal. We need to keep the tax rates low for individuals and corporations and in partnerships. It just creates more taxpayers. It creates more money and it creates more tax flow, cash flow and taxes, which we've seen. There's more money coming through the coffers now because of the Trump tax cuts we've ever seen before. The problem, as you know, Jack, is spending is an issue, and that's a whole other conversation. The government's spending too much based on the income they've got coming in. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're heading toward a shutdown. I mean, I think hopefully we can get the appropriation bills that you're talking about, the 12, put together and do something we haven't done in a long time. We've been operating our country over what they call continuing resolutions, CRs as they call them, which is stupid because what it says is let's just spend today what we spent yesterday. Well, yesterday put you in debt, now you can spend today what put you in debt before. So the government has a horrible business plan. As I say, we got the greatest product in the world, freedom, liberty, competition, entrepreneurship. It's called America, but our customers are not given good service. And our business model, our cash flow, we have none, and we're broke. So we got to fix it. Well, we'll see. We'll see what, the Senate and the House, we don't agree on everything all the time. That's part of the way we're set up here. But we'll see. I mean, I think it's too early to say that the House is not going to do it. We want to get it done as supposed to, and we got good leadership in McCarthy, and we got good chairmen in our committee. So let's just see what's going to happen. Let's see if we can make government work for a change.
Congressman Roger Williams, Chair of the Small Business Committee, thank you so much. Up next, what's the solution to inflation? We ask 4 members of Congress about that, plus hear more of their comments about a potential spending fight that could lead to a delay in the new federal budget and lead to a government shutdown. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas. We'll be right back. Inflation has eased from this time last year, but prices haven't come down everywhere, especially when you've been shopping in the grocery store. Polls show people are not happy about the economy. I asked members of Congress from North Texas how they would solve inflation earlier this week during a panel discussion I moderated as part of a congressional forum sponsored by the Dallas Regional Chamber.
I was raised by a single mother here in Dallas who was a public school teacher, and I know, and we've spoken to the North Texas Food Bank just a little while ago, about what these price increases do to families from personal experience, and to me, this is something that has to be one of our top priorities. We are seeing, though, that inflation has come down to 3%. Unemployment is at 3.5%. We just had our 31st straight month of job growth. So we're having some positive signs in the economy, but we're not seeing all the costs coming down. That has to be, I think, the next step in terms of where we go. I think, can point to that wage growth for the first time this spring and in the last couple of years finally outpaced inflation. So we'll see folks, I think, starting to feel better about some of these things. But to me, it always has to come back to getting our supply chains as strong as possible. I'm one of the founders and co-chairs of re-founders of the Supply Chain Caucus. And in some of our meetings, we've really gone over, I think, some things that have shown me where these bottlenecks were and how we can address them. So we have to address those, but also continuing to make sure that we're turning out folks who are getting into good paying jobs. And we have so many great corporate citizens in the room today who have been a part of that. So many great of our academic institutions here that are part of that, training our folks up so they can get in these good paying jobs that are growing, that are moving forward, whether it's UTD or Dallas College System or SMU. We are an area that is growing so rapidly because our economy is attracting folks, and it's attracting families who want to come here, raise their kids here, get a good job here, and get into a home where they have enough room. And that's why we're a boom town right now, and our area is a boom area. And I want to thank the folks here who are part of that. We'll certainly do everything we can at the federal level to join in that.
Congresswoman Van Dyne.
Look, inflation has slowed. The growth of inflation has slowed, but let's face it, we're still having to pay a lot more now than we were paying 3 years ago. We've seen double digit. Just because it's now slowed does not mean, to your point, they were not seeing ridiculous prices. And working families are feeling that the worst. I think empowering those working families, empowering businesses that are providing opportunities, and coming up, quite honestly, with a responsible budget where we're not looking at trillions of dollars of spend and trillions of dollars of added debt, which has directly contributed to our high inflation rate. I had 2 women yesterday. We did a job fair. It was awesome. We could talk more about that. But we're trying to really get people employed, and which is one of the reasons why on the Republican side of the aisle we held off on one of our last bills because it didn't have job requirements. When we're talking to businesses across the district, that's one of the big things that they told me that they needed was we're looking to hire people. We want to empower people. We want them to be able to keep more of what they make, but to be able to be independent, to be able to have jobs that provide for their families, provide for their futures. And yesterday we had 2 women who were in the mortgage industry, and they both lost their jobs because they were closers. And they said, inflation has led to huge increases in interest rates. Interest rates have been raised 11 times in the last 12 months. And when you look at what that has done to people being able to buy a house, or people in the banking industry, they both lost their job as a direct result of that. So my response is having much more accountability on how much we're spending, being able to empower our businesses to be able to employ people, being able to employ the individual, keeping more money in their pocket, less taxes, but also getting back to typical things like job requirements. If you're getting entitlement programs, I think it's basic. But nobody can live beyond their budget, and the federal government seems to do that on a daily basis.
Congressman Self.
Inflation should have been no surprise to anyone. When the Fed dumps $6 trillion into the money supply in the last few years, too many dollars chasing too few goods with our supply chain problems, it should be a surprise to no one. But to the average family, prices have gone up 16, 17%, yet they've taken a real wage cut of 3%. You're approaching a 20% difference for the families on the street. We've got to soak that money out of the economy. We've got to rebalance the supply chain with the money in the economy. And until that happens, I don't think we're going to see inflation get down anywhere close to their target rate.
Congressman VC.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, the big thing that I can tell you, and of course this is anecdotal, and I know that you have more polling information, but when I'm out and about and I'm talking with people, people are glad that the gasoline prices finally have stabilized. At one point, we were back up to 4+ in many cases, a gallon. You heard people on the west coast of the country and on the east coast, but particularly on the west, talking about gasoline that was like $6+ a gallon. I know that I talked to a military family that's at Edwards Air Force Base that were from Arlington, and they talked with me about just how even with the BAH, that's base allowing housing that they got for moving to California, that it wasn't enough to offset how much the gas prices had gone up. And so that's good that we took the right steps to help bring down some gas. But I will tell you that this will always be an issue, and I think it's something that people have forgotten about, because when we forget about things so quickly, we move from one political cycle to the next. But I want you to think back to 2016, when two of the leading presidential candidates, on the Republican side, you had Donald Trump, and on the Democratic side, you had Bernie Sanders. And they made income inequality and wages a big part of their campaign. It was really untraditional for a Republican to sort of take that approach. I think it made a few people in the business community probably a little uneasy that the Republican candidate started to talk about that. But unless you do something to address people's income in this country, not keeping up with the growth that we've had and with the productivity that we've had in this country, I think is going to be an issue that continues to last for a long, long time. And I think that when you saw Donald Trump talking about that in 2016, I also believe that you're going to see more and more Republicans, particularly as that party continues to make inroads in places like rural Texas and another rural small town enclaves across the country. It's going to be more and more a part of that message. And so I think that the way that we're talking about that issue today and the way that my Republican colleagues are talking about that issue today will probably look a lot differently 2, 4, 6, 8 years from now, unless we do something about the growing gap that we continue to see between what businesses bring in and what the everyday working family brings in.
As we showed you earlier, these members of Congress expressed concern about a spending fight and a potential government shutdown. Here's more of what they had to say. Let's talk about spending. August 8th is today, and yet the House comes back September 12th. October 1st is when the new budget starts. Are we headed for a government shutdown or a major fight over spending? Congressman Self?
Well, the House has passed one of the 12 appropriations bills. The other 11 have been passed out of committee. I think the Senate has passed all 12 out of their committee. So we have 11 bills to pass out of the House. We have 12 days in session before that date that he mentioned. Folks, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are not going to pass 11 bills. Senate passed their 12 bills, get a conference done, get it back to the two houses to pass the final bill by September the 30th. Beyond that, you hear the permutations all over the map. Will we have a short-term continuing resolution? Will we have a long-term continuing resolution? Will we have a shutdown? There is a group that is committed, first of all, that if we don't see substantial border movement in terms of securing the southern border, we're not sure we want to give DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, any funding. So there are significant issues in the spending bills and the appropriations bills going forward. I hate to prognosticate, I won't, but just keep your TV tuned, because it's going to be high entertainment for the next month, once we get back in session in 12 September.
Sounds like a fight is brewing. Congressman Vesey?
I'm very worried about a government shutdown. I mean, you think about the DFW area alone. You were asking about our two major airlines here. You think about the patent office that you have here in downtown Dallas. You think about the Earl Cabell Federal Building and all the employees there. You come over to Fort Worth and you think about the printing plant, the FAA regional office, and so on and so on. And whenever we have one of these shutdowns, as members of Congress and the local delegation, we start getting calls from friends that we went to high school with and family members that are concerned about whether or not they're going to get their next check and how long the shutdown is going to take. a lot of these small businesses that are a big part of the economic engine here, you know, it really hurts them when these government employees don't have the money to go and shop with them. And so yes, I'm very worried about a shutdown. I will tell you, I think the biggest mistake that Kevin McCarthy made was that he should have just held out a few days longer. There was no way that group of 10, 12, 15, however many of them there were, there was no way that they were going to let this drag on too much longer than it eventually did, because it would have been an embarrassment to the Republican Party. It would have imperiled their majority for the 2024 election. And instead, what he did was that he caved into them. And now you have a group of people that can call with just one vote, just a single member can call to vacate the chair, and it's just no way to lead. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in. This being able to get a government spending bill to keep the government going should not be hard, and we don't want to start going back into the business of trying to run the government with a CR. I'll never forget when I first came into Congress and they had started the whole sequester deal that was supposed to help with spending. And I remember Bell Helicopter over in Fort Worth, just adjacent to my district. I think they immediately ended up laying off like 1,000 people because of that, because it just created so much uncertainty. And so I think that it's a bad idea. I don't know how really from this point on until January the 3rd, 2025, how we're not going to be able to avoid these sort of showdowns that you watch on cable news and people hear about it, people have distress about it and are concerned about how we're going to stop this from happening, because the speaker made a very, very bad deal and it hamstrung his ability to really be strong and effective.
Congressman Allred.
Well, I don't think we can be cavalier about a government shutdown. It costs us tens of billions of dollars in economic output. It's incredibly bad for the country. We're also trying to lead the world on so many different fronts right now. It's bad for our competition with China, and it just in every way we have to try and avoid that. We struck a deal around raising the debt ceiling that set budget cap limits and that set spending levels and that had real cuts. And now the Republican Congress looks like they are backing away from that agreement. And it looks to me like we are heading towards, if not a shutdown, then a continuing resolution, which for folks who don't know what that is, it just continues spending levels where they are or for whatever the determined period is, but it doesn't allow for planning, doesn't allow for new things, doesn't allow for some of the projects that we are working on and that we've tried to get into the appropriations process. Listen, I came into Congress, like Mark was mentioning, during a time when we had a Republican Senate and a Republican president, and we found a way to avoid, to agree on what we were going to set our spending levels, and understanding that we didn't have every level and every lever of power. And I think there has to be give and take from both sides on this. There has to be an understanding that we are the world's best hope and superpower. We have a lot of responsibilities. We have a growing and I think recovering economy. We need to keep this progress going. We have to get out of our own way by not drawing lines in the sand that are unrealistic or trying to pursue, unfortunately, what I've seen, which is culture wars through the budgeting process. When I see every single project that has LGBTQ listed in it pulled out of a budget process, I think that's not about saving money, that's about targeting people. And that, to me, that's not consistent with our values as a country, and it's not the way that appropriations and the way we fund our government should work. So hopefully we can avoid it, but I'll agree with my colleague, Congressman Self, that I'm worried about where we're going. I'll certainly do what I can to avoid it, but we're not on a good path.
Congresswoman Van Dyne, I imagine you have a difference of opinion?
I do. Having actually lived through a government shutdown and being a federal government employee during a shutdown, I can tell you, government employees during a shutdown, essential government employees continue working. Every government employee, once the shutdown is over, gets paid in full. It's not like if we go out of work for 30 days, government employees that are not essential go home, they don't answer their phones, they don't look at their emails, they don't go to work, and for that full 30 days, let's just say, they get paid 100% once the government opens back up. So they are made, unlike in the private sector, where if you were to shut down, for example, during the pandemic, where a lot of governments forced the shutdown of private businesses, they didn't get repaid. Federal government, they do, and essential workers continue working. I think Republicans are very responsible. We passed the only bill that came out of the House, the Senate, or the presidency that would actually avoid a default, that actually increased the debt ceiling, but it also was the largest tax cut and spending cut in our nation's history. And you saw the majority of Republicans all vote for that bill. All but two, all vote for that bill. It was the Limit, Save, Grow Act. I think the biggest mistake that McCarthy made was actually negotiating down, not allowing the Senate to do its job because they sat on it. Apparently, the Democrat-run Senate was fine with just going into default. They sat on that bill, which forced McCarthy to have to negotiate with Biden, and everything was cut down from the Limit, Save, Grow Act. Now, I think if Republicans were really responsible and we were looking at not normalizing the massive $1 trillion of spend that we saw during a pandemic, Democrats wanted to normalize that. I'm sorry, but we spent trillions of dollars in an emergency situation that no longer exists. So we wanted to get back to pre-pandemic spending, and that's what the LSG did. What we were promised was we're going to have appropriators that are looking at those spending limits, recognizing we are no longer in a pandemic, stop excusing it to have more excuses to spend more and more money, recognizing that those policies immediately resulted in increase in costs, inflation, and take a responsible, again, measure at a responsible budget. So when we come back, do we want to have a government shutdown? Absolutely not. Are we going to have appropriations bills that are more reflective of pre-pandemic levels as opposed to normalizing the additional money that we spent in an emergency situation? If that is the case, you've already seen that Republicans are willing to vote for that bill, and I think you'll see the appropriations reflective of those numbers will pass.
That's all for Eye on Politics this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next week. I'm Jack Fink. You're watching CBS News Texas.